On a quiet, tree-lined street in Howard Beach, Queens, sits a house. It is unremarkable by design, a two-story residence of brick and stucco that recedes into the suburban landscape. There is nothing in its current appearance to suggest it was once the nerve center of a criminal empire, the throne room for the most powerful mob boss in America. It presents itself as a place of quiet domesticity, its history scrubbed clean by the simple, relentless passage of time. The architecture is a study in calculated modesty, a modified Tudor style common to the area. It was built to blend in, to be a part of the neighborhood, not to loom over it. This choice was not an accident of taste, but a strategic declaration. It was power so confident in itself that it had no need for the vulgarity of a fortress wall or a gatehouse. The fortress was the community itself. The walls were the silence of neighbors. Today, the property belongs to a private family, acquired through an ordinary real estate transaction. The deed has been transferred, the name on the mailbox changed. Legally, the house has been severed from its past, a piece of property like any other, subject to mortgages and property taxes. It is an asset, its value measured in square footage and market comparisons, not in fear and influence. Yet, an invisible residue remains. The air around 16011 85th Street seems denser, the quiet more profound. It is the silence that follows a storm, a stillness that carries the memory of immense noise. This was once a stage, constantly surrounded by the hum of FBI surveillance vans, the flash of press cameras, and the reverent approach of men arriving to pay tribute to their king. A flagpole stands on the lawn, a feature installed by its former master. It still flies the American flag, but the symbol has been hollowed out and refilled with a new, simpler meaning. What was once an act of defiant irony, a mobster cloaking his enterprise in the fabric of the nation he defied, is now just a mundane expression of civic pride, its previous context erased. The house was a panopticon in reverse. From its windows a ruler could survey his domain, but more importantly, the entire neighborhood watched the house, their gazes forming an unspoken perimeter of loyalty and intimidation. The children playing on the sidewalk, the mailman on his route, the families tending their gardens, they were all unwitting sentinels in a kingdom disguised as a suburb. Within its walls, the story is one of ghosts and echoes. The scent of expensive cigars has long faded from the wood paneling. The clinking of crystal glasses during clandestine meetings is gone, replaced by the sounds of a modern family. But spaces retain memory. The geometry of the rooms, the way light falls across the floor. These things were shaped by a specific will for a specific purpose. This structure was the ultimate physical manifestation of a singular ego. It was not built to be a home in the conventional sense, but a theater for a man who understood power as performance. Every brick was a line in a script, every renovation a new act in a drama of his own making. The house was his co-star, a silent, complicit partner in the grand illusion. Its defenses were never obvious. There were no battlements, no visible fortifications. The security was woven into the fabric of the place, in reinforced structures hidden from view, in sightlines carefully considered, in the psychological certainty of its owner that no one would dare breach his sanctuary. It was a bunker of the mind as much as a shelter of brick and mortar. The great paradox of the house is that it was a symbol of absolute power that chose to appear ordinary. It was a rejection of the distant, isolated estates of previous dons. This was power embedded in the street, accessible, visible, and all the more potent for it. It was a throne deliberately placed not in a palace but in a living room. Now its interior has been remodeled, its secrets papered over. The Italian marble that once spoke of illicit wealth has been replaced. The custom furnishings that seated capos and consiglieres are gone. The house has been stripped of the very things that made it a monument, leaving only the shell, an empty vessel that once held the immense dark energy of a criminal dynasty. The structure remains, a silent witness to a spectacular rise and an inevitable collapse. It saw the plotting, the celebrations, the paranoia, and finally, the breach. It has outlived its creator, standing now not as a symbol of his power, but as a quiet testament to its impermanence. Luxury was just the surface. What happened inside few dared to know. To discover the secrets sealed within these walls, and the man whose ambition they mirrored, stay with us. If you believe every structure tells a story, subscribe for more chronicles of ambition and ruin. To understand the house, one must first understand the man who willed it into being. He was not born into a dynasty of marble and mahogany. His name was John Gotti, and his cradle was the hard, unforgiving pavement of New York City, a world far removed from the manicured lawns of Howard Beach. He was a product of the city's forgotten corners, where ambition was a currency more valuable than cash, and respect was earned not through inheritance, but through force. His ascent began in the lower echelons of the Gambino crime family, one of the 5 monolithic pillars of La Cosa Nostra that held New York in a shadowy grip. In this world, a man was measured by 2 things: his capacity to earn and his capacity for violence. Gotti proved exceptionally skilled at both. He was a street-level predator with an innate understanding of human weakness and a chilling pragmatism that cleared his path of obstacles and rivals. But Gotti was animated by a different kind of hunger than the men who came before him. The old guard of the mafia operated from the shadows, their power felt but rarely seen. They were ghosts in the machinery of the city, their names whispered in backrooms and federal wiretaps. They cultivated an aura of invisibility, believing that true power was anonymous, absolute, and silent. This philosophy was anathema to John Gotti. For him, power that could not be seen was no power at all. He was possessed by a profound and pathological narcissism, a deep-seated need not just to be in control, but to be the star of his own violent epic. He craved the spotlight with the desperation of a performer, viewing the world as a stage and its inhabitants as his audience. His ambition was not merely to rule the underworld, it was to become a legend within it and beyond it. He envisioned a new kind of Don, one who did not hide behind shuttered windows or operate through intermediaries. He would be a king who walked among his people, a figure of both fear and adoration, his authority broadcasted in the headlines and reflected in the fearful eyes of his enemies. This desire for visibility was a radical departure from mafia tradition and a direct challenge to his own boss, Paul Castellano. Castellano was the archetype of the old school, a man who saw himself as a corporate chairman rather than a street boss. He ruled from a sprawling, secluded estate on Staten Island, a remote fortress he called the White House, deliberately isolating himself from the grit and grime of the streets where the family's wealth was generated. Gotti held Castellano's detachment in contempt. He saw it as a sign of weakness, an abdication of the raw personal authority that was the bedrock of their world. A king, in Gotti's view, could not rule from exile. He had to be present, his power a tangible force in the daily lives of his subjects. He needed a throne, but not one hidden behind miles of private road and high walls. And so the vision for the house in Howard Beach began to form, long before the first brick was laid in its renovation. It was not a dream of sanctuary, but a calculated strategy of presence. The choice of a modest, 2-story home in a middle-class neighborhood was a deliberate and brilliant act of psychological warfare. It was a rejection of Castellano's ivory tower and a declaration of a new philosophy of power. The house on 85th Street was to be the antithesis of Castellano's estate. It would be accessible, visible, embedded in the very community that formed the base of Gotti's support. By living there, he was making a statement. I am one of you. I have not forgotten the streets. My power does not come from a boardroom, but from this pavement, from these houses, from your loyalty. This was a performance of humility that masked an ego of monumental proportions. The house's unassuming Tudor facade was a carefully crafted piece of public relations. It was designed to project the image of a family man, a good neighbor, a pillar of the community who just happened to be the most powerful criminal in the country. It was a mask of normalcy, intended to disarm suspicion and cultivate a fierce local loyalty. Behind this facade, however, a different reality was being constructed. The interior of the house was a reflection of Gotti's true self, the self that craved luxury and reveled in the spoils of his empire. While the exterior was designed for the public gaze, the inside was his private palace, a testament to his vanity and his success. Millions were poured into transforming the suburban dwelling into a personal fiefdom. Walls were reinforced, opulent materials were imported. Italian marble, A stone synonymous with the palaces and cathedrals of the old country was laid across the floors. Fine woods panelled the rooms where strategies were plotted and sentences were passed. The house was being remade in its owner's image, a plain shell concealing a core of immense decadent power. Every detail was a manifestation of his psyche. The state-of-the-art kitchen was not just for cooking. It was a stage for the performance of domesticity and generosity. The backyard pool, complete with a waterfall and cabana, was not just for recreation. It was a venue for the grand spectacles he would host, reinforcing his status as the neighborhood's benevolent patriarch. Even the flagpole erected on the front lawn was a masterstroke of symbolic manipulation. By flying the American flag, Gotti was wrapping his criminal enterprise in the fabric of the nation he defied. It was an act of supreme irony, a gesture that simultaneously claimed legitimacy and mocked the very idea of it. He was presenting himself not as an outlaw, but as an alternative form of American success. The house then was conceived as a dual entity. It was a home and a headquarters, a public stage and a private sanctuary. It was a symbol of Gotti's connection to the streets and his elevation above them. This duality was the key to his power. He could be the man of the people, greeting neighbors on his front step, and moments later, retreat inside to become the absolute monarch of a violent kingdom. This structure was the physical anchor for his reign. It was more than a place to live. It was the center of his universe, the point from which his influence radiated. It was a conscious and obsessive project, the architectural materialization of a dream of a power so absolute, so confident, that it had no need to hide in the shadows, but could stand proudly, defiantly, in the broad daylight of a quiet suburban street. With the assassination of Paul Castellano outside a Manhattan steakhouse in 1985, the center of gravity in the New York underworld shifted violently. Power, once held in a remote Staten Island estate, now rushed to fill a vacuum in Queens. The modest Tudor-style house on 85th Street, until then a captain's residence, became a throne room overnight. The transition was not just one of leadership, but of philosophy. The era of the Shadow Don was over. The reign of the celebrity king had begun, and his palace was to be remade in his image. The house began to swell with the spoils of a newly conquered empire. As John Gotti consolidated his grip on New York's construction unions, the city's concrete and steel were transmuted into Italian marble and polished mahogany within his home. Each successful extortion racket, each hijacked cargo load, funded another layer of opulence. The property became a living ledger of his crimes, its renovations a physical manifestation of the Gambino family's expanding influence under its new, audacious leader. This transformation was a calculated act of symbolic warfare. Castellano's White House had been a symbol of corporate detachment, a fortress designed to keep the grime of the streets at bay. Gotti's home was the opposite. It was a weapon of proximity, a declaration that power resided not in isolation, but in the heart of the territory. The house did not loom over the community, it was embedded within it, drawing strength from the web of loyalty and fear that defined the neighborhood. Inside, the illusion of suburban normalcy dissolved. The living room, with its designer furniture and fine art, was no longer a space for family gatherings, but a royal court. Here, capos and soldiers would arrive, hats in hand, to deliver their weekly tribute. The ritual was always the same, a deferential greeting, the passing of an envelope thick with cash, and a brief audience with the Don. It was a theater of fealty, where the hierarchy of the underworld was performed and reaffirmed daily, just steps away from where children played on the sidewalk. The basement was transformed into a war room. Far from the prying eyes of FBI surveillance vans parked down the street, it was here that strategies were debated and sentences were passed. In these paneled, sound-mitigated spaces, disputes over territory were settled, promotions were granted, and the fates of rivals and traitors were decided. The house was a place of judgment, its foundation resting on secrets and verdicts that would never be recorded in any official court. The property was also a mask, its exterior meticulously crafted to project an image of benevolent patriarchy. Gotti understood the power of public perception. He was not merely a gangster, he was the protector of Howard Beach, its unofficial mayor. The house was the centerpiece of this performance. Its doors were often open, its owner visible, greeting neighbors with a smile and a wave, cultivating an image of a man of the people. This performance reached its zenith during the annual 4th of July celebrations. The street would be blocked off, and the entire neighborhood was invited to a lavish barbecue on Gotti's property. Thousands of dollars were spent on food, entertainment, and a spectacular fireworks display that rivaled the city's official show. These were not mere parties, they were modern-day bread and circuses, calculated displays of largesse, designed to buy silence and manufacture consent. Through these events, the house became a symbol of a different kind of social contract. In exchange for loyalty, Gotti provided protection, order, and spectacle. He was the local potentate who delivered for his constituents in ways the legitimate government could not or would not. The fireworks exploding over his roof were a declaration of sovereignty, a signal that this small corner of Queens operated under a different set of laws. Yet, for all its public functions, the house was ultimately a psychological bunker. It was the one place on earth where John Gotti felt truly untouchable, shielded by the physical presence of his family and the unwavering allegiance of his community. Within its subtly reinforced walls, surrounded by the material proof of his success, the paranoia that haunted him on the streets could momentarily subside. It was his sanctuary. The architecture itself reflected this dual purpose. The open layout of the first floor and the backyard pool area were designed for public display, for the performance of power. But the private quarters, the reinforced rooms, and the advanced security systems spoke to a different reality. They were the architecture of a man who knew he was a target, a king who understood that his throne was built upon a foundation of violence that could one day be turned against him. The constant, visible presence of the FBI became part of the house's ecosystem. The federal agents in their sedans were as much a feature of the landscape as the manicured lawns and the flagpole. This created a strange symbiosis. The surveillance confirmed Gotti's importance, elevating his status in the eyes of his followers. For Gotti, being watched was proof that he mattered, a validation of his power. This constant scrutiny, however, turned the sanctuary into a gilded cage. The house became the epicenter of a war of counter-surveillance. Aware that the walls had ears, Gotti developed his famous walk-talks, forcing his most trusted associates into ambulatory conversations through the neighborhood streets to foil listening devices. His own home, the very symbol of his control, was a place where he could no longer speak freely. The pool, with its cascading waterfall, was more than a luxury. It was a strategic asset. The sound of the falling water was intended to muffle conversations, creating a small zone of acoustic privacy in a world of hidden microphones. Every feature of the property was assessed for its tactical value. The house was not a passive dwelling. It was an active participant in the ongoing conflict with the state. Even the objects within the house were imbued with meaning. A gifted piece of art was not just decoration, it was a tribute from a subordinate, a symbol of allegiance. The expensive crystal glasses were not just for drinking, they were used to toast to illicit victories and sealed pacts. Every item was a relic of the empire, a piece of the mythology Gotti was carefully constructing around himself. The home became a physical extension of Gotti's ego. Its refusal to be an overt fortress was the ultimate statement of arrogance. It suggested a power so absolute, so confident in its control over its environment, that it had no need for high walls or iron gates. The true defense was the silence of the neighbors and the fear of his enemies. The house stood as a testament to a belief in invincibility. This blending of domestic life with criminal enterprise created a surreal atmosphere. Inside, a man could order a murder in the basement and then ascend the stairs to have dinner with his children. This compartmentalization was essential to the psychology of its owner. The house allowed him to maintain the fiction that he was two separate men, the loving family patriarch and the ruthless mob boss. The Italian marble floors were cold and hard, a fitting surface for a place where unyielding decisions were made. They reflected the light from ornate chandeliers, creating a dazzling effect that belied the dark nature of the business conducted upon them. The luxury was a form of anesthetic, a way to normalize the grotesque reality of the source of that wealth. The state-of-the-art kitchen was a stage for Gotti's performance of the generous host. He would often cook for his associates, serving large meals in a display of traditional hospitality. This act of breaking bread was a powerful ritual, forging bonds of loyalty that were deeper and more tribal than any business contract. The kitchen was an instrument of psychological control. Ultimately, the house on 85th Street was a paradox. It was a command post disguised as a family home, a public stage for a man who craved the spotlight, and a private fortress for a king consumed by paranoia. It was both a weapon in his arsenal and the anchor that chained him to a single location, making him a predictable and stationary target for his adversaries. Every element of the house was a monument to his ego, but which piece spoke the loudest? The flagpole that claimed a piece of America for himself, the imported marble that paved his floors with illicit profits, or the open door that declared his power needed no walls? The answer lies somewhere in the architecture of ambition, a question perhaps best considered by those who study the intricate blueprints of a downfall. The mid-1980s marked the zenith. The house on 85th Street was no longer a residence aspiring to power. It was the seat of an emperor. Its modest Tudor facade had become the most recognizable address in the American underworld, a place where the laws of the United States seemed to pause at the curb. Power, raw and undisputed, radiated from its core, settling over the quiet streets of Howard Beach like a permanent low-lying weather system. Here, at the height of his reign, John Gotti had achieved his ultimate ambition. He was not merely a boss, but a monarch, and the house was his court. Its rhythms dictated the pulse of a citywide criminal enterprise. The daily comings and goings were not those of a suburban family, but of an administration governing a shadow state. A quiet street in Queens had become the de facto capital of a violent, sprawling kingdom. The illusion of domesticity was masterfully maintained. From the outside, one might see children's bicycles on the lawn or hear the distant sounds of a television. But this was a meticulously curated stage. The true business of the house was conducted in a language of coded gestures and silent understandings, a world away from the tranquil surface it presented to the uninitiated eye. This was the era of absolute confidence, of a power so entrenched it felt eternal. Gotti had remade the mafia in his own image, visible, defiant, and glamorous, and the house was the physical embodiment of this new order. It was a declaration that the shadows were no longer necessary, that a king could rule in the open, shielded not by high walls, but by the sheer force of his own audacity. The empire's lifeblood was cash, a relentless torrential flow of illicit money that converged on this single point in Queens. Every week, a procession of high-ranking Gambino family members made the pilgrimage to Howard Beach. They arrived not as guests, but as vassals, their purpose singular and solemn, to deliver tribute to their lord. This ritual was the central ceremony of the Gotti administration. In the living room, or sometimes in the more private confines of the basement, captains and soldiers would present their offerings. Envelopes thick with the earnings from a week of extortion, loan sharking, and illegal gambling were handed over with a deference bordering on religious reverence. It was a sacrament of the underworld. The money came from every corner of the city's economy that the Gambino family held in its grip. It was skimmed from the concrete poured for Manhattan skyscrapers, the tax levied on the garment industry, a percentage of every sanitation contract, and the profits from countless backroom card games and sports betting operations. Each dollar was a testament to the family's pervasive control. The house became a treasury, a central bank for a nation without borders. Inside, far from any official ledger, the city's criminal product was counted, sorted, and redistributed. This was the raw fuel of the empire, the tangible evidence of its power, handled in the very same spaces where family dinners were held and holidays were celebrated. The proximity of crime and domesticity was not a contradiction. It was the point. This physical currency, however, presented a logistical problem. A mountain of cash is both a symbol of success and a liability. It needed to be cleaned, transformed from the proceeds of crime into legitimate assets. The house on 85th Street was the command center for this vast and intricate laundering operation, an invisible mechanism that churned beneath the surface of the visible empire. From here, Gotti directed a constellation of front businesses. These were not sophisticated shell corporations in offshore havens, but humble, cash-heavy enterprises woven into the fabric of the city. Pizzerias, social clubs, small construction firms, and waste management companies all served as conduits, washing the dirty money until it flowed back into the system, seemingly clean. Gotti's own official employment was a masterpiece of this financial fiction. On paper, he was a traveling salesman for a plumbing and heating supply company, a no-show job that provided a thin veneer of legitimacy. This modest occupation stood in stark, almost comical contrast to the millions of dollars that passed through his hands and funded his extravagant lifestyle. The management of this financial network required constant communication, a dangerous necessity in an age of escalating electronic surveillance. The famous walk-talks were born of this dilemma. Gotti would lead his most trusted lieutenants out of the house and through the neighborhood streets, discussing strategy and issuing financial directives where he believed no microphone could reach. The entire neighborhood became his conference room. The house, therefore, was the brain of the operation, but its thoughts had to be spoken outside its own walls. This paradox defined the peak of Gotti's power. He controlled a financial empire from his living room, yet he was a prisoner of the very technology his enemies used, forced to pace the sidewalks of his kingdom to conduct its most sensitive affairs. The laundering schemes were not just about personal enrichment, they were about sustaining the entire organization. The cleaned money paid for lawyers, supported the families of imprisoned soldiers, and funded new criminal ventures. It was the institutional bedrock of the Gambino family, and its flow was managed with the precision of a corporate treasurer, all from a suburban home. This system created a surreal economy within Howard Beach itself. Local businesses, whether through loyalty or fear, often became unwitting participants in the cash-based ecosystem. The line between the legitimate and the illicit blurred until it was almost meaningless. The entire community was in a sense on the Gambino payroll. The immense wealth also allowed Gotti to project an image of generosity that was in itself a form of control. He was known to hand out cash to neighbors in need, to pay for community events, to ensure the local church was well funded. This was not charity, it was a strategic investment in silence and allegiance. The empire's influence, however, was not confined to cash transactions and street-level rackets. From the nerve center in Howard Beach, tendrils of power extended into the supposedly legitimate world of politics and commerce. The Gambino family's control over key labor unions gave it a chokehold on New York's construction industry, one of the most powerful economic engines in the world. No major building project in the city could proceed without the family's implicit approval, which came at a steep price. This was extortion on a grand scale, a hidden tax that inflated the cost of every new skyscraper and public works project. Decisions that shaped the city's skyline were influenced by conversations that took place in Gotti's basement. This level of control required a network of compromised individuals, union officials who owed their positions to the mob, contractors who paid for labor peace, and inspectors who looked the other way. The house on 85th Street was the place where these worlds intersected, where the unspoken agreements that kept the city running were forged. While Gotti himself rarely met with high-level politicians or corporate CEOs, his orders, issued from the house, were transmitted through a chain of command that reached into the highest echelons of the city's power structure. He was the invisible hand guiding outcomes, the silent partner in 1,000 legitimate enterprises. The power was not just coercive, it was seductive. Association with Gotti, even indirectly, brought a certain kind of order and predictability to the chaotic world of New York business. He was a man who could make problems disappear, who could enforce contracts with a certainty that no court of law could match. The house then was more than a criminal headquarters. It was an alternative seat of government. Disputes were settled here, deals were brokered, and a form of rough private justice was dispensed. For those within its orbit, the authority that emanated from this suburban home was more real and more immediate than that of City Hall or the White House. At its peak, the reign was a spectacle, and the house was its grand stage. John Gotti understood that power, to be truly effective, must be performed. The annual 4th of July block party was the premier production in this long-running theater of dominance. It was a public display of a power so immense it could afford to be generous. For this one day, the street was sealed off, transformed into a private fairground. Thousands of dollars were spent on food, drink, and professional entertainment. An enormous fireworks display, illegal for any private citizen, was launched from a nearby barge, a volley of light and sound that announced Gotti's sovereignty over the neighborhood. This was not a party, it was a political rally. By feeding the masses and dazzling them with spectacle, Gotti was reinforcing the social contract he had established. He was the patriarch, the provider, the man who brought prosperity and celebration to his people. In return, he expected only one thing: absolute loyalty. The event was a masterclass in public relations. It presented the nation's most powerful mob boss as a benevolent community leader, a family man who loved his country and his neighbors. The images from these parties, often splashed across the city's tabloids, helped to build the myth of the dapper Don and endeared him to a public fascinated by his defiance. Inside the house during these events, a different kind of performance took place. While the neighborhood celebrated outside, the inner sanctum was reserved for the family's elite. Here, amidst the noise of the party, business continued. The celebration provided the perfect cover for the constant flow of capos and associates paying their respects. The house was thus a place of profound duality. It was a public venue for the performance of community and a private chamber for the administration of a criminal empire. Gotti moved between these two worlds with seamless ease, the gracious host one moment, the ruthless monarch the next. Yet beneath the pageantry and the unshakable confidence, a deep and corrosive paranoia was taking root. The house, the ultimate symbol of Gotti's power, was also the focal point of his enemies' attention. Just down the street, in nondescript sedans, the FBI maintained a constant silent vigil. Their presence was a permanent feature of the landscape, a quiet reminder that the king was under siege. This constant surveillance transformed the sanctuary into a psychological pressure cooker. Every window, every wall, every telephone line was a potential vector for betrayal. The very air within the house grew thick with suspicion. Gotti, a man who built his empire on secrets, could no longer trust the privacy of his own home. The house became a bunker, not against physical assault, but against invisible intrusion. Conversations were held in whispers, if they were held at all. The need to conduct business on the street during walk talks was a stark admission that the fortress had been compromised from within by unseen technology. This created an atmosphere of profound isolation. Gotti was surrounded by family, by loyal soldiers, by an adoring community, yet he was utterly alone with the burden of his secrets. He was the undisputed ruler of his domain, but he was also its most prominent prisoner, confined by the geography of his own power and the relentless gaze of the federal government. The opulence of the interior, the cold marble, the gleaming fixtures, the designer furniture, began to feel less like a reward and more like the gilded bars of a cage. The house was his throne, his fortress, and his prison all at once. He had achieved a level of power his predecessors had only dreamed of, but in doing so, he had made himself a stationary and predictable target. The reign was absolute, but it was also brittle. The very visibility that Gotti had craved was now the instrument of his potential undoing. He was a king who could not abdicate, a performer who could not leave the stage, trapped within the walls of the monument he had built to his own ego. The perfect, manicured lawn and the proudly flying American flag projected an image of serene, untouchable power. But inside, the silence between conversations was growing longer, filled with the unspoken fear of listening devices and the gnawing suspicion that even the most loyal soldier could be turned. The cracks were not yet visible, but the foundations of the house and the empire it represented were beginning to shift. Empires do not collapse in a single thunderous moment. They decay from within, eroded by the slow, patient work of their own internal contradictions. For the kingdom ruled from 85th Street, the first signs of this decay were not visible cracks in the brickwork, but subtle shifts in the atmosphere. The confidence that had once radiated from the house began to curdle into a brittle, defensive arrogance. The performance of untouchability became more strained, more desperate. The constant, silent presence of federal surveillance had ceased to be a mere annoyance or a badge of honor. It had become a form of psychological warfare, a slow, grinding erosion of the certainty that had been the bedrock of Gotti's power. The agents in their cars were no longer just an audience, they were a patient, waiting predator, and their stillness was more menacing than any overt threat. Inside the house, the air grew heavy with this unspoken pressure. The rituals of power continued, the weekly tributes, the strategy sessions, but they were now shadowed by a pervasive paranoia. Trust, the essential currency of his world, began to devalue. Every subordinate was a potential informant, every loyal statement a possible lie. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like an echo chamber for his own anxieties. The fatal flaw was not in the house's defenses, but in its master. John Gotti's greatest asset, his charisma, his command of the stage, was inextricably linked to his greatest weakness, his voice. He was a man who needed to speak, to hold court, to boast, to instruct, to dominate every conversation. Silence was an abdication of power he could not tolerate, and in this lay the seed of his destruction. His enemies understood this better than he did. For years, the FBI had tried and failed to breach the physical and psychological defenses of the Howard Beach home. Every attempt to plant a listening device had been thwarted. The house was a fortress against electronic intrusion. A space Gotti had successfully sanitized, but the king had other courts, other throne rooms. The focus of the investigation shifted from the quiet suburban street in Queens to the noisy, chaotic heart of Little Italy. The Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street was Gotti's downtown office, his public stage. It was a place where he felt equally secure, surrounded by the comforting noise of the street and the deferential silence of his men. It was here, in this second fortress, that the first true crack appeared. The FBI's solution was one of elegant, patient simplicity. They did not attempt to bug the club itself, a space swept for devices daily. Instead, they targeted the modest apartment of an elderly widow directly above it. It was a Trojan horse, a listening post hidden in plain sight, positioned directly over the head of the most powerful and paranoid mob boss in America. In late 1989, high-technology microphones were secretly installed. They were so sensitive, they could capture the conversations happening one floor below, filtering out the street noise and focusing on the one voice that mattered. While Gotti paced the floors of the Ravenite, confident in his security, his every word was being captured, converted into an electronic signal, and recorded onto magnetic tape. The sanctuary had become a studio. Gotti, blinded by his own arrogance, walked into the trap day after day. He held his most sensitive meetings there, believing the thick floors and the noise of the city were his shield. He did not realize that his own voice, the instrument of his power, was now being turned into the primary weapon for his annihilation. The resulting recordings were a revelation. They were not snippets of coded language, but a detailed, unambiguous oral history of a criminal enterprise, narrated by its own leader. On tape, Gotti was heard discussing the inner workings of the Gambino family, plotting extortion schemes, and demanding a greater share of the illicit profits. He spoke of murder with a chilling nonchalance, confirming his role in conspiracies and ordering new ones. Most damningly, he was captured discussing the 1985 assassination of Paul Castellano, the very act that had propelled him to power. The Teflon Don was methodically stripping away his own protective coating, one recorded syllable at a time. But the tapes captured more than just criminal conspiracies. They captured the corrosion of loyalty at the heart of the empire. Gotti was heard complaining bitterly about his subordinates, questioning their loyalty, their intelligence, their earning capacity. He was a king who held his own court in contempt, and his words were a poison seeping into the foundations of his rule. Crucially, he spoke with disdain about his underboss and oldest friend, Salvatore Gravano, known as Sammy the Bull. He questioned Gravano's loyalty and mocked his ambition. These were the words of a paranoid monarch, isolating himself at the top, and they would prove to be his most catastrophic miscalculation. He was creating the justification for his own betrayal. The invisible enemy of sound waves had breached a fortress that guns and battering rams never could. The recordings provided what years of surveillance and witness testimony had failed to secure. Irrefutable proof, spoken in the clear, confident voice of the man himself. The government now possessed the blueprint to his downfall. The house on 85th Street still stood, its facade as immaculate as ever. The flagpole still flew the American flag. The neighbors still saw the powerful Don coming and going, a picture of suburban authority. The illusion of permanence was perfectly maintained, but the structure was now a hollow shell. Its power had been predicated on secrets, on a wall of silence. That wall had been demolished, not by an informant's whisper, but by the king's own boastful pronouncements, captured miles away in a dark room by a spooling magnetic tape. The cracks were no longer metaphorical. They were real, etched into the oxide of a recording, waiting to be played in a court of law. The foundation of the entire empire had been fractured, and the quiet house in Queens, the symbol of its defiant strength, was now resting on nothing but air. The fall was no longer a question of if, but when. The facade remained, but behind the meticulously maintained exterior, the ruin had already begun. The sound of the collapse was already on tape, waiting for the world to hear. The end did not arrive with a thunderclap at the house on 85th Street. It began miles away, in the heart of Manhattan, with the quiet click of handcuffs. On the evening of December 11, 1990, federal agents entered the Ravenite Social Club and arrested John Gotti. The king was taken not from his throne, but from his downtown court. The news traveled through the city's nervous system like an electric shock, a seismic event that registered most profoundly in the quiet enclave of Howard Beach. For a few hours, the house stood in a state of suspended animation. Its lights burned against the winter darkness, its facade projecting the same image of immutable power it always had. But its animating force was gone, held in a federal detention center. The structure was now a body without a soul, a command post without a commander, waiting for a final, inevitable violation. The empire, built on a foundation of presence and visibility, began to dissolve with its leader's absence. The network of fear and loyalty that had made the neighborhood an impenetrable fortress was predicated on the certainty that the Don was just inside, watching. With him gone, that certainty vanished, and the unspoken perimeter of defense evaporated into the cold night air. The government's next move was not a negotiation or a legal maneuver. It was a physical act of symbolic conquest. The warrant had been signed, sealed by the invisible evidence of Gotti's own voice on magnetic tape. The objective was no longer just to monitor the house, but to enter it, to breach the sanctuary and dismantle its mythology brick by brick. In the pre-dawn hours, a convoy of federal vehicles moved silently through the sleeping boroughs of New York. This was not a tentative approach, but a full-scale invasion force, its purpose to execute a surgical strike on the heart of the Gambino Empire. The quiet streets of Howard Beach, accustomed to the lone surveillance sedan, were now to be filled with the machinery of the state. As the procession turned onto 85th Street, the operation shifted from a strategic plan to a tangible reality. The house came into view, its windows dark, seemingly unaware of the fate that was approaching. For years, it had stared down the federal government with defiant impunity. Now the government was coming to its door, not as a silent observer, but as a claimant. The neighborhood, which had for so long served as a human shield, was rendered irrelevant. The loyalty of neighbors, the code of silence, these were defenses against the logic of the street, not against the overwhelming force of federal law. The community could only watch from behind drawn curtains as the fortress prepared to receive its conquerors. The breach was swift and brutally efficient. There was no prolonged siege, no standoff. At the precise moment, agents swarmed the property. The front door, which had welcomed capos and vassals with quiet deference, was forced open. The sound shattered the morning stillness, a percussive announcement that the old laws of Howard Beach had been suspended. The illusion of a normal suburban home was instantly and permanently destroyed. The interior, once a private stage for the performance of absolute power, was flooded with armed agents. They moved with a cold, practiced purpose, transforming the space from a residence into a crime scene. Every room, every object, was now potential evidence. The family within, who had lived cocooned in the myth of untouchability, was confronted with the raw power of the state. Their sanctuary was being systematically violated, its sacred spaces profaned by the very authority their patriarch had so publicly defied. The psychological shock was as profound as the physical intrusion. The house, a character that had been complicit in so much secrecy, was now forced to give up its secrets. The agents began a meticulous dissection of the property. This was not a simple search. It was an autopsy of an empire. They were looking for the physical traces of the wealth and power that had been administered from within these walls. They moved through the opulent rooms, their tactical gear a stark contrast to the designer furniture and polished marble. The living room, where tribute had been paid, was now a staging area. The basement, where strategies had been plotted, was scrutinized for hidden compartments. The house was being read like a text, its architecture interrogated for clues. Every surface was examined, every piece of furniture moved. They tapped on walls, listening for the hollow sound that might betray a hidden safe. They lifted floorboards and inspected ceiling panels, searching for the cash, the ledgers, the weapons that were the material grammar of Gotti's reign. The search was a deliberate act of demystification. The symbols of power were stripped of their aura and reduced to their material components. The imported Italian marble was just cold stone under the agent's boots. The fine mahogany paneling was just wood that could be pried away from the wall. The house was being deconstructed, its power disassembled piece by piece. This was the ultimate inversion of control. The man who had obsessively managed every detail of his environment was now absent, unable to stop the methodical violation of his most personal space. The house, his physical extension, was being subjected to an intimacy he would never have permitted, its privacy irrevocably broken. The agents worked under the glare of portable lights, casting long, dancing shadows that made the familiar rooms seem alien. The home was no longer a home. It was a grid, a series of sectors to be cleared, catalogued, and processed. The scent of coffee and cigar smoke was replaced by the sterile smell of latex gloves and the dust of disturbed secrets. The raid was a media spectacle. From behind police barricades, cameras captured the relentless activity. The images broadcast to the world were devastating, federal agents carrying boxes of potential evidence out of the dapper Don's fortress. The impenetrable castle had been sacked, its treasures carried off as spoils of war. The house itself seemed to sag under the weight of this public humiliation. Its carefully maintained facade of suburban normalcy was now the backdrop for a scene of conquest. It was no longer a symbol of defiant power, but a monument to a spectacular and irreversible fall. Does true power lie in the concrete and marble of a fortress, or in what remains when the walls are finally breached? If the architecture of ambition fascinates you, subscribe to witness the foundations of other empires crumble. When the agents finally departed, they left behind a profound silence. The house was wounded, its interior in a state of controlled chaos. Furniture was displaced, carpets were pulled back, and the invisible order of the home had been shattered. It was a physical manifestation of the empire's collapse. The raid had yielded little in the way of blockbuster evidence. Gotti was too careful for that. But its symbolic impact was incalculable. It had proven that there was no place he could hide, no sanctuary the law could not reach. The throne room had been entered, and the king's mystique had been shattered forever. In the days that followed, the house on 85th Street became a tourist attraction of the macabre. Cars slowed as they passed, their occupants staring at the place where a modern monarch had been dethroned. The flagpole still stood, the American flag fluttering in the winter wind, but it now seemed less an act of defiance and more a symbol of surrender. The ruin was complete. Not a physical ruin of crumbling brick, but a deeper, more significant ruin of meaning. The house had been built to project an idea of untouchable power embedded in the heart of a community. The raid had exposed that idea as a hollow fiction, proving that a throne built on a suburban lawn is in the end just a house on a street, subject to the same laws as any other. The conviction rendered the final verdict not just on a man, but on a place. The moment the gavel fell, the house on 85th Street ceased to be a capital. The invisible energy that had animated its walls, the potent mixture of fear and fealty, dissipated as if a circuit had been broken. It reverted to its original state, a collection of brick and wood on a quiet suburban street, now hollowed out, its purpose extinguished. The silence that descended was not the calculated quiet of a predator at rest, but the empty, profound stillness of a tomb. The king himself was exiled to a realm of concrete and steel, a world stripped of all symbols. John Gotti, the dapper Don, traded his Brioni suits for a prison jumpsuit, his Italian marble floors for a polished concrete cell. His throne was now a metal cot, his audience a handful of guards. The man who had commanded the city's attention with a gesture was reduced to a number in a federal penitentiary, his power contained, his voice confined to the monitored calls of a man serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. His end came not with a bang, but with a final cruel irony. In 2002, John Gotti died of throat cancer. The voice that had been his greatest weapon, the instrument he used to command, to charm, to intimidate, and ultimately to incriminate himself, was silenced by a slow, cellular betrayal. The man who could not stop talking, whose words were captured on tape and used to build his own cage, was ultimately rendered mute, his final days spent in the solitary silence he had so desperately fought to avoid. For years after his imprisonment, the house remained in the possession of his family, a living mausoleum holding the ghost of an empire. The 4th of July fireworks no longer lit up the sky. The procession of capos bearing tribute had long since ceased. The property lingered in a state of purgatory, no longer a center of power, but not yet just a house. It was a landmark of a fallen dynasty, its notoriety slowly fading into a kind of suburban legend. The final indignity was not a raid, but a foreclosure. The fortress that had once held the finances of a criminal empire could no longer support its own weight. The house appeared on the open market, its history both a selling point and a liability. The language of its listing was one of square footage, property taxes, and market comparisons, a sterile financial vocabulary that stripped the structure of its myth and reduced it to a simple asset, another piece of real estate in a city full of them. In 2019, the transaction was completed. New owners, a private family with no connection to the Gotti legacy, took possession. They began the slow work of reclaiming the space, of overwriting its dense, dark history with the mundane palette of a new life. Walls were repainted, floors were replaced, and the sounds of a modern family began to fill the rooms where sentences had once been passed and strategies of war had been devised. Yet, air structure never truly forgets. The ghost of its purpose remains embedded in its very design. The sightlines from the windows, the layout of the rooms, the subtle fortifications hidden within the walls, these are the architectural scars of its former life. The house may have been domesticated, but its bones were forged for a different purpose. It remains a silent witness, its memory sealed behind fresh layers of paint. And so, we return to the quiet tree-lined street in Howard Beach. We see a house, unremarkable in its design, that recedes into the suburban landscape. But we can no longer see it as it once was. The illusion of normalcy has been shattered forever. We know now that its modesty was a form of arrogance, its silence a container for immense noise. Its ordinary facade is no longer a mask, but a monument to a spectacular and cautionary tale. The neighborhood, once an extension of the house's power, has moved on. The web of loyalty and fear that formed an invisible perimeter has long since dissolved. The name that once commanded automatic deference is now just a part of local history, a story told to newcomers. The power was personal, tied to the man, and when he was removed, the spell was broken, leaving only the quiet streets he once ruled. The house was not a fortress that failed, but a stage built for a tragedy. Its very design, so open and embedded in the community, was a reflection of its owner's fatal flaw, the need to be seen. It was a monument to a power that craved the spotlight, and in doing so, it illuminated the path for its own destruction. It was a bunker made of glass. A man builds a fortress of brick and marble to make his name eternal. But when the walls are sold, and the name is only a whisper in a prison cell, what truly remains? Is power the structure that stands, or the fear that vanishes when its architect is gone? If stories like this make you see power from a different angle, subscribe to follow other downfalls as astonishing as this one.